mass in those high density urban environments. And there are climate change adaptation concerns inside cities. If I think about Jakarta myself, the amount of times I've been walking to work and, the rivers are running, they're overflowing. We've got populations living on those waterways. Infrastructure isn't able to accommodate the amount of water, which is then leading to displacement of populations. It disproportionately affects marginalised and the poorer communities. I know when I worked in and lived and worked in South Asia, the impacts of climate change and weather events on populations, such as in Nepal, in Kathmandu Valley, in Sri Lanka when I lived there for a number of years. So these are real events, and the way that RWI works, or the way that we position ourselves in a pretty populated space, is that we always come from a human rights perspective. So a human rights perspective, in a nutshell, is basically putting people in the centre of responses. And to think about rights, of course, we're all aware of rights frameworks, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. A lot of the constitutions throughout Asia have got human rights embedded in them. There's a lot of human rights work that's done at the national level and at the regional level, such as ASEAN's human rights commitment. So we're across those areas. We've also been doing some research in the Pacific, and we've got some really good resources if you're interested in that, and the direct impact of what's actually happening in the Pacific when it comes to climate change and the impact on communities. And they're real events for people. A couple of years ago, before COVID, I was in Fiji, meeting with the Ministry of Environment there, and they had up to, I think it was around 60 communities that they had to think about and had to work with to address the impact of rising sea levels. So that takes a lot on when you're talking about communities that have Indigenous communities, or communities that have got a cultural connection with locations as well. And we've got to really be aware of that, is that often a lot of communities actually have a connection with land. They are the custodians of that land, and they have an ingrained or an in-depth relationship with that land and that place. So trying to somehow navigate those important factors with relocating communities, and often relocating them into places which are not where they're from, and also in locations which are safe. So it's a major concern for governments. It's a major concern at the local level. We are well connected across the region with local mayors and local, what you would call the council areas, or the people that are the provincial level, which are dealing with the population and a lot of their concerns. And they're struggling. They really have got so many things that they have to consider. So part of our approach is to work with people and to share resources, to build networks, to bring people together, convene people who are action makers or decision makers and communities, and to really ensure that the perspective of people are at the centre of things, because it's easy to be swept up in policy and politics and the politics of climate change. But at the end of the day, it's us, it's individuals that need water, that need food, that need sustainable energy, need energy that is actually accessible, not too expensive, it's renewable. It's, you know, all this transitioning work is a major issue. So we value and acknowledge journalism. We really feel that, particularly long-form journalism, it's something that is, as you would well know, you're in the journalism field, is that there's a sort of been this trend towards clickbait, short messaging, and even what should I say, the reduction in finance or capital for journalists and newspapers and all these type of things, and a move towards online commentary, which is often misinformed. It can be sensationalist, it can be destructive, it can be harmful, it can be overly politicized, and we need to be very vigilant on that. And also, of course, let us not forget that there is a real danger for journalists in speaking up, and the amount of journalists that have been harmed, threatened, killed as a result of their activism in this area. So it's not lost on us. We very much respect the role of good evidence-based informed journalists that are able to contribute and to able to put forward a balanced, fleshed out discussion in their various mediums. So we're very pleased to be partnering with PPN on this, PPMN, I should say. And also we're very pleased that we're now, we ran something similar just for Indonesia a few weeks ago, and we're now really pleased that we're here at this the regional level. And I'm so pleased to see such a broad range of participants today. I would encourage you to join our socials, to keep an eye on our website. We are continually releasing material. We've got really great research which you can use. We've got briefs, because we appreciate that journalists are busy. So we have condensed a lot of our research into what we call policy briefs or information briefs, and they're available on our website, which I'm sure Yulia and the others will share with everyone. And we also, of course, have got, as an institution in Lund in Sweden, because we're a Swedish organisation, we have got leading researchers and well-informed experts on this, and Claudia is one of those. So we are very pleased to be able to give you access to Claudia. We've got so many others in our different areas, and I encourage you to visit our website there. And we are always available to connect and to respond and to contribute as well. We also have been writing some material ourselves, and we publish, of course, in the academic sphere a lot. We do a lot of policy work, which is at ASEAN level and things like that. But also we're interested in writing some good articles and journals with journalists and placing them in incredible long form, I would say. Let's talk a little about long form, because it's a dying art, long form journalism, but it's such an important space. And I think that decision makers are influenced by a good article or a good long form journalism that presents some stuff. And we've had some good results in the Jakarta Post and I think the Diplomat as well. We ended up there. So we've got some good examples, and we've also got capacity to co-author and to provide good, what I'd say is rigorous evidence, which is reliable for journalists. So that's it from me. I've probably taken a little bit too long, but I really do encourage you to connect with us. We see this as the starting point. This isn't the end. We really do hope that you keep a relationship with RWI and that we keep a relationship with your various expertise and interests, and we can contribute to your profession, which is so important in creating change, but also contributing to discourse, which is such a valuable part of journalism. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Jason, for your welcoming speech. Okay, so now for the second remark, I would like to welcome Annie Mulia as the Director of Indonesian Associations for Media Development, or PPMN, for her speech. So, Mbak Annie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nana, our MC today, and thank you to Jason too. Well, I'm very happy today to see all of you here in this very important forum. I see, although we are talking about regional issues on environments, but I see all the participants and speakers are coming from almost all over the world, not just Southeast Asia region, but we have also someone from America and then from Europe, I believe. So yeah, I think it's because what we are today will be discussing and tomorrow is very important for all of us. I think we all know that this event is created to promote environmental journalism with a human rights perspective. In particular, in covering climate change and the climate crisis, journalists must use the perspective of the protection of the rights of every human being to gain access to safe and sustainable nature and environment. For this reason, journalists must continue to improve themselves and their skills to understand the climate change issues and the various crises it causes in life. In addition to that, journalists need to always take side with the public, especially the vulnerable groups or marginalized groups we sometimes call, who I believe receive the most impact from the climate change crisis, such as women, indigenous, poor people in, I think, every country in the world. Journalists must be able to make sharp and in-depth reports to promote discourses on solutions to environmental problems. I think that is the on-ground base why we are creating this conference for journalists today and tomorrow. And to face all the challenges, I think Jason previously already mentioned so many challenges that we are facing in journalism. One of the things that we can do to face all of the challenges is the collaboration. We want that this event also becomes a forum to collaborate among journalists, sharing experiences, supporting each other, and gather all resources and skills to strengthen each and every one of us in producing quality reporting are forms of collaborations. I guess that the partnerships between PPMN, RWI, and Internews EJN today to organize this event is a good example of how we work in collaborations to present this conference for you all in today's. I will not take much longer time because I think we are really wanted to start the discussion today. But before that, I would like to say thank you very much to our partners, RWI and EJN, for making it happen today. I'm really enjoying our collaborations, and thank you for all speakers and moderators who have made your time to prepare, to talk your thoughts and share your experience in this forum, and also to you all participants who already registers and attend this conference. I think that's all from me. Thank you, and back to you, Nana.
Okay, thank you, Mbak Annie. Thank you for the welcoming speeches from the RWI and PPMN. And now, without further ado, we are about to start the first session on regional challenges on climate change and human rights coverage. Now, I would like to invite Yulia Supadmo as the moderator for this session to join us. Yulia Supadmo is the editor-in-chief at the Raja Wali Televisi or RTV Indonesia since 2017. Graduated from University of London, her skills include in-depth interview, in-depth reporting, news presenting, newsroom management, program production, project research, and commissioning. To Mbak Yulia Supadmo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nana. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first session of the Journalism Conference on Reporting Human Rights and Climate Crisis in Southeast Asia. I'm Yulia, and I will be guiding everyone through the session. We have a stellar panel of speakers for this first session. And before we go into introducing our panel, just a reminder that this conference is organized in joint collaboration by the Raoul Wallenberg Institute, the Indonesian Association for Media Development, PPMN, and the Earth Journalism Network. Now, we're hoping that this conference will help you participants, journalists, get an understanding of human rights perspective in reporting of climate change and environmental crisis. We're also hoping that everyone will be able to enhance your skills in writing reports on environmental issues and human rights. And also this conference should be able to be a space for you to learn and share experiences and collaboration in reporting on the environment and human rights. Now, the first session, our theme is regional challenges on climate change and human rights coverage. And we're hoping that we will be able to cover issues to identify the current issues in climate crisis and its impact on human rights in the region. We're also going to identify the challenges that journalists and media have faced in covering these issues. And we're also hoping to address how you can network, get support, and maybe collaborate to find solutions and to produce quality reporting on these issues. And lastly, if we have time, we will definitely address some of the lessons that we've gotten from the latest COP26 conference and how the media and journalists have covered that conference. Now, our session will last until about 9:45. There will be a Q&A session in the last 30 minutes of our session. And please, for participants who do wish to pose questions, please write your questions in the chat box. And when it's time for the Q&A, with the help of the committee, we will ask you to raise your questions either directly or through me, moderator. And please also note who the question is addressed to, which speaker you want to answer your questions. Now, without further ado, let me introduce our great speakers this morning. First of all, we have Claudia Ituarte-Lima from RWI. Claudia, good morning. Claudia is coming, good morning, or rather, I think it's evening for you, right? You're in Canada?
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay, well, welcome. Claudia is an affiliated senior researcher at RWI. She is an international public lawyer and scholar with a specialty in human rights, biodiversity, and climate law nexus. She has been working in climate change and environmental issues for more than 15 years. Her focus has been on law and governance for sustainability and environmental justice, transformation of international law into new governance forms at national scales to support indigenous development and implementation of sustainable development goals. Please stop me if I'm going too fast for any of the speakers. She has covered many, many regions, including Mexico, Peru, Ecuador, Kenya, Senegal, and Europe. Our next speaker is Amy Sim. Good morning, Amy, coming to us from Singapore.
Good morning. Hi, everyone.
Amy is with the Earth Journalism Network. She is a senior Asia program manager. She has been a consultant as well for the World Bank in Indonesia and Myanmar for a number of projects, including the Compact Governance for Growth program in Indonesia, social development projects, and she was also involved in the Aceh post-tsunami recovery program with the World Bank. Before that, Amy was a journalist with Singapore Press Holdings, and she has been involved with environmental work for more than a decade. Our third and final speaker is Joydeep Gupta. Good morning, Joydeep, coming to us from Delhi.
Good morning.
Very early for you, yeah?
Well, it's good to get up early, isn't it?
Well, we'll debate that later after the session. So Joydeep is the director for Third Pole Project. Joydeep is also the India coordinator for Indonesian Earth Journalism Network. He writes, commissions, and edits articles on climate change, water biodiversity, pollution, and sustainable development. He was or is currently a vice president for Forum of Environmental Journalists in India. Joydeep also teaches environmental journalism at the OG Jindal Global University. And among his accomplishments was winning the 2012 Green Globe Award from the Delhi Sustainable Development Summit. And he's also been a journalist for a number of publications, including Indonesian News Service, The Statesman, The Sunday Observer, and The Sunday Mail. So that's quite a mouthful from our speakers. Now let's get right into the core of the matter. I would like to invite first Claudia to speak to us. Maybe we can hear from Claudia how the issue of climate change and the environment is directly connected to human rights and what journalists should focus on when we look at these three issues. The floor is yours, Claudia.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. And just to make sure that, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Yes, thank you. So, well, it's a pleasure to be here with you. I'll be talking about how do we connect the dots between climate change, environment, and human rights. Okay, sorry, it seems to be a problem with the PowerPoint. Okay, so in the last UN climate conference, Mia Mottley, who is the Prime Minister of Barbados, said that unfulfilled climate adaptation and mitigation measures are measured in lives and livelihoods, and that this is unjust. I think this gives us an example of the kind of challenges that we face when different people are experiencing different effects of climate change. We are all part of what it's called the biosphere, which is this relatively thin layer where life can actually survive and thrive. So humans have been the driving force of humanity, but of the world as a whole. And it's estimated that if the trajectories of greenhouse gases, of inequality continue, an average of 170 million people will be experiencing internal migration by 2050. And it is clear that while we are all experiencing this climate change, not everybody has caused in the same way this climate emergency. Indigenous people, local communities, women, youth, children, future generations are among the ones that will be disproportionately affected. And I think here, journalists have a key role to tell their stories. And here, I would like to invite you, yes, to talk about these disproportional effects that climate change and environmental degradation is having on these groups. However, I would also like to invite you to open the frame in the sense of many of these people that are in vulnerable situations are also the ones triggering transformative change for positive socio-ecological outcomes. And I'll give you some examples. When we're talking about planetary challenges, climate change, without any doubt, is one that it's currently affecting us globally. However, again, as journalists, I think you have a very important role to play in terms of connecting these challenges, because otherwise we may risk not to solve any of them. As you see, these planetary boundaries include climate change, but it's also very much connected to biodiversity loss, land conversion. And all of these ecological ceilings are the ones enabling us to have a good quality of life, are our social foundation. So we see that all our human rights, from food, health, life, water, adequate housing depend on this healthy environment. And at the same time, sustainable development also depends on the respect of human rights. We think about information, participation, access to justice. Those are key in enabling these thriving ecosystems that then can provide and support nature to continue to provide us with those contributions. And here is important not only for present, but for future generations. We have various multilateral environmental agreements, like the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, but also others, for example, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, among many others. However, the first one to specifically refer to the connections between climate change, environment, and human rights is the Paris Agreement, which makes explicit reference to obligation of human rights, right to health, right of indigenous people, local communities, migrant children, also refers to gender equality, empowerment of women, and intergenerational equity. And while this is very important to advance at this global level, we see that there's a gap, there's an accountability gap in terms of those that are on the front lines of defending these nature contributions to people that I was mentioned before are increasingly at threat. And this, as you see in this map, it is a global crisis, also as UN Special Rapporteurs on Human Rights and Environment have highlighted. Previously John Knox and now David Boyle. Global Witness recorded more than 220 environmental defenders killed just in 2020. And we see, while it's global, Asia is among the regions most hardly hit. So in a world where injustice is all too prevalent, how can we find ways to foster, to catalyze this climate environmental justice? Can human rights law help us in this journey? Well, we have that in 2021, in October, the United Nations Human Rights Council, through Resolution 48/13, recognized for the first time that the clean, safe, sustainable environment and a healthy environment, it is a human right. So this has been a long journey. And while this resolution was negotiated and adopted by states, more than 1,300 organizations, women organizations, rural communities, children groups were behind calling for this resolution to recognize the right to a healthy environment. Also, again, while this is a global achievement, this was very much inspired also by advances at the national and regional levels. So here in dark green, you can see the countries which have recognized the right to a healthy environment in their constitutions, and the light green, constitutions that have specific provisions concerning a healthy environment. And among them in Southeast Asia are Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam. And we see that this is also a result of the work that many right holders are doing in terms of bringing cases to court, in terms for advancing this interpretation and making these recognized rights matter in practice. So this recognition also builds on the work, for instance, of the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Environment, the previous one, and the Framework Principles on Human Rights and Environment, that again is a succinct document that I would encourage you to see. It refers to substantive obligations, for example, regarding what we want to achieve. For instance, healthy water, healthy food, clean air, and so on. So these substantive obligations, but also procedural obligations. What are these means that allows us to actually enjoy this well-being? So here I will go and discuss them a little bit later. And this heightened obligation of state to protect the rights of people in vulnerable situations. And when we're talking about these procedural elements of the right to a healthy environment, this includes three core elements. Information, and this information helps for identifying vulnerabilities, but also for strengthening capabilities. To give you an example, in Hat City in Thailand, the municipal government, after feeling the effects of climate change, specifically flooding, realized that they needed to team up with civil society and local communities. So they engage in a participatory process to develop jointly flood risk, participatory mapping, community action plans. This is very much related to public participation. And this public participation, as highlighted by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, for instance, in relation to adaptation for sea level rise, it is vital. And just as the example that I gave you, in the extent that communities are empowered, is that they will be able to adapt better to climate change. Access to justice, and this includes in climate adaptation, mitigation, but also in degradation of the environment. To give you an example, in Philippines, there was a ruling in favor of young Filipinos and who directed the government to clean up and protect the bay, not only for present, but for future generations. And this kind of jurisprudence is not only inspiring jurisprudence in Southeast Asia, but also all over the world. So there are innovations happening in Southeast Asia that the world is, and I think should be, increasingly learning from. So again, how do we link these realities at the local level with these global processes, with these global UN resolutions? And we have a specific resolution, for example, in March 2019, which recognized the critical role of environmental human rights defenders. And these environmental human rights defenders, as highlighted, they are risking their today for our tomorrow. And this is why your role as journalists of magnifying their voices, both of the vulnerability that they may be, but also of the benefits that they are bringing. Because I think when we're talking about human rights, we really need to open the frame to also include hope, to also include innovations through law that can take us where we want to go. Which I understand that sometimes as journalists may be challenging to put forward these positive stories, these positive narratives of how do we get there. But I would really encourage you to find and to discuss strategies throughout these 2 days. So to conclude, human rights provides the legal and normative framework embedded in international and national law, here to empower right holders to exercise and benefit, but also contribute to a healthy environment. And here there are various tools, such as legal empowerment methodologies. And I think the role that you can have also in magnifying their voices is very important. Enhancing the capacities of duty bearers to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. And while the work led by right holders is extremely important, so is the work led by duty bearers. Alone, they cannot engage in the transformative change that we needed to address the climate, biodiversity, and pollution crisis. We need to enhance the capacities of duty bearers and right holders to really work together to address these critical challenges of our time. And again, human rights law can help us identify of what needs to be transformed in legal and policy implementation for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals in an integrated way and achieve these transformations for sustainability that benefits all, leaving no one behind. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Claudia, for that enlightening presentation. May I now invite Amy Sim to provide her presentation. Amy will be focusing on, from a more journalistic perspective. Amy, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me just get the slides on. Let me know if you can see it.
Yep, all good.
Yeah, I'm trying to make it go full screen, but it's not. Yeah, here you go. Hi, so once again, good morning, everyone. My name is Amy Sim, and I work at the Indonesia of Journalism Network as the Asia Senior Program Manager. Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting EJN to participate in this really interesting and very important conference today. I think both Jason and Claudia and Ibu Eni as well have talked about the link between climate change and human rights, and the importance of looking at climate change from human rights angle and lens. And as journalists, climate change stories are human rights stories. As journalists, we focus a lot on people, on the stories, and that's where we have a big role to play in conveying this information about how climate change is impacting on our ability to achieve and fulfill our human rights. Why is climate journalism important? We just touched on that, about the importance of climate change in helping in fulfilling all of our human rights. And I think Claudia mentioned the importance of the public to have the right to participate and decisions around climate change, relating to climate change, will and are impacting on our daily lives, on the daily lives of the public, and in order for individuals to be able to participate in that decision making, to influence that decision making, they need information. And journalists, all of us here, play a really important role to keep the public up to date about the latest science, impacts, solutions, instruments that are relating to climate change, how they will impact on the lives and their basic rights. I thought I would just use stories today to show some of the angles, some of the stories that we've been seeing, that EJN of Journalism Network has been supporting journalists to do, that bring out the climate change from a more human rights angle. And I think the right to health is one that we see often touch on. The WHO in their recent reports, they have stated very clearly that climate change is the single biggest health threat that's facing humanity. And in the stories that we're seeing in Southeast Asia, for instance, we're seeing stories, journalists are reporting about how climate change and the increase in temperature is driving up dengue and other diseases, especially the vector-borne diseases. And these are hitting the poorest communities the most, and they're really burdening, overwhelming the health systems in the respective countries. And I think we all know that it brings climate change brings extreme weather like heat waves, and natural disasters are more frequent and more deadly. And here we see some examples of stories in Vietnam about the urban heat island effect, and in the Philippines, how having to deal with cyclone is becoming part and parcel of everyday life. And aside from physical health, I think we need to also remember and look into stories about how climate change is affecting our mental health. With more natural disasters, with more deadly disasters, they are leaving, they are taking a serious toll on the mental health of communities. And not to mention the climate anxiety as well, that are felt by lots of people across the world. I would like to give an example here of a story from Pakistan that we've supported to illustrate how storytelling can have an impact, very important and direct impact to the lives of the communities that we write about. This story was written by a Pakistani journalist, Amar. He wrote about how the 2015 heat wave not only really affected the communities there that year, but it continued to affect the health of communities years later. And this story triggered more coverage on TV and other media reporting. And an NGO eventually contacted this journalist to help to cool down the tin roofs of the slums where the dwellers are really feeling the heat, from the environment that they're living in. And after that event, the chief minister of this particular region also called up the journalists to learn more about the situation there, and led to the local authorities formally recognizing the legal status of about 36 slum areas, so that these communities are able to receive public health services. That was, one big problem that they're facing. They are getting the impact of heat waves, yet they have no access previously to public health services because of the lack of a legal status being slum dwellers. So this actually made a big difference to the lives of these communities. Women's rights, I think that's another angle that we can look at. Climate change is putting women's health at risk. We have a story here from Central Java. I think a lot of participants are from Indonesia here in Pekalongan, where lots of women work in batik, in the batik industry. Whenever there are floods, these ladies, we have to work standing in water, up to their knee, up to their, for long hours, and that is really taking a toll on their health as well. And we are also seeing more and more stories about how climate change is affecting the reproductive health of women, and especially in coastal areas where rising sea levels is bringing, is increasing the salinity of water that people are consuming, and for pregnant women, this put them at a greater risk of preeclampsia, hypertension, and even infant mortality. And the right of child is the other angle that we can look at. And this story that we supported in Indonesia look at a report that was produced by Save the Children that talks about how children in Indonesia are going to be really affected by the climate crisis. They will feel temperatures 7.7 times hotter than their grandparents, 3.3 times more flood threats that they will experience. There are many, many, many other examples of climate and human rights stories. And obviously, it impacts on lots of livelihoods, affects. In Cambodia, for example, it's causing, a loss of fish stock. It's affecting fishers who really depends on the fish stock in Tonle Sap, for example, for their lives. It changed people's way of lives and cultural practices and identities. I think Jason mentioned in the Pacific Island, especially Pacific Island countries where we also have some activities and support for journalists there. We are seeing a lot of stories of migration of villagers being asked to shift because of rising sea levels and people being uprooted from their villages, and that has a very big impact on their culture, the traditions and identities, which are very, very closely tied to the land. There's one story which is very interesting that a journalist is looking at, is how it affects the bureau, the cemeteries, how their the loved ones of communities in the Pacific, how the cemeteries have to be moved into different places, and how that really affects their ability to perform their rights. And of course, we're seeing more use of human rights mechanism, legal channels to address climate change. I think in Southeast Asia, this is still very slow moving, I think. But I think, as Claudia mentioned, we're seeing some, positive kind of development in this area. And I think increasingly journalists can start looking into court cases, legal proceedings to explore stories on climate change. This particular story in the Philippines, I think, bring out some complexity of climate change and human rights stories. It's about an indigenous group in the Philippines. They have been displaced by a new development project that's launched by the government, which is labeled and branded as a climate resilient city project. But in fact, this project will forcibly relocate this Etwa group, indigenous group of people. And the story wrote about their struggle, and it really generated public debate and support, and galvanized local advocacy, and really move forward. And I think that snowballed into a national campaign and brought about some very, very positive movements there. And looking at challenges in climate reporting, I think we all know that there is climate fatigue. People are there's such a lot of talking about a toll on mental health. That's the massive amount of information that we are getting about the impact of climate change is causing some fatigue. So it is really important also to pay attention to how people are taking actions, stories that can show the agencies of local communities, how they're addressing, how they're taking action, how they are advocating their government to take actions to address climate change. Those stories are also very important. Security risks, I think we all know the Global Witness does a very good job of telling the danger that environmental defenders, human rights defenders are facing in their work, and increasingly we're also seeing journalists being targeted. And in our part of the world, in Southeast Asia, we know that data may not be always available, information may not always be transparent. It is really, really important for journalists to work together, to be creative, and to find ways and different angles to explore your stories. And and media get caught up by political blaming, nationalism. I think these we are all very familiar with in this region, and just generally the squeeze and budgets that we are all facing. The newsroom means journalists don't have time to reach communities who are most at risk. They don't have the resources to go out, to take a few days out to do a really important story. And the result of that is that a lot of journalists may rely on just press releases and press events for their stories, and the voices of communities who are most affected, most vulnerable, are not seen in the media because of that. Some tips here. Always remember, to focus on communities who are the most vulnerable and affected. The importance of linking local and global development. What is discussed at the COP26 in Glasgow recently? How does that what does that mean to the everyday person in the street? What does that mean to you and I? And bring out these stories. And all the human rights instruments that Claudia mentioned, how are those instruments going to impact on lives? Linking it to people, places, and local contexts. The human rights framework is really important for journalists to be familiar with them, so you can use those framework, those tools to hold governments to account. Be familiar with the UN agencies and human rights organizations. They will be very good sources of information, very good people to go to for interviews. I think we see a lot of youth movement, and in this most recent People's Climate Vote report by the UN, 2 in 3 adults believe that climate change is a global emergency, and we see for the children, this is the even more children than adults believe in this statement. And the young audiences are a group that we should also target, and their actions, solutions. I think I've mentioned working with your peers who are covering other beats. The climate story, the climate change story is not just an environmental story. It's not just a human rights story. It's an economy and finance story. It is a health story, as we've seen. So work with your colleagues who are covering these other beats, and also collaborate with journalists from other countries. And be savvy in digital security. This is addressing the security risk increasingly faced by journalists, especially, physical security is very concerning, but at the same time, I think we're seeing more attacks and more kind of tactics being used through digital means. So it's important to learn how to protect yourself online. I think we have quite a lot of resources at EJN. I just want to put it out here. Please go to our website if you're a journalist interested in covering climate change and other environmental stories. We provide fellowship to the Climate Change Conference every year. We just brought 20 journalists, as you see here, 12 of them from Asia, to Glasgow to cover the Climate Change Conference, COP26. We have lots of reporters' resources on our website with tip sheets on how you can cover climate change and other themes. We provide story grants and mentorship. In fact, we have a story grant call at the moment that's open on green recovery. And we also provide grants to organizations, media networks, journalist networks, and we currently have an open one with the deadline of 15 January. Do have a look. We also provide special projects grants for thematic special project reporting, training workshops, webinar e-learning. I think, I'll leave you there. And please feel free to explore on our website to find out about all these opportunities and resources that are available for journalists to cover climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Great tips for us journalists if we want to cover these climate change and environment stories, linking them to human rights. I see there questions are starting to come in. Please, as I said in the beginning, write your questions in the Q&A chat box. Please designate who the question is for, and we will get to you after we hear from Joydeep. Remember to formulate your question as concisely as possible so that the speakers will be able to accurately address your questions. May I now invite Joydeep to join us, and we'll start getting into the more practical elements of this morning's theme. Amy, could you maybe take down your slides? Thank you. So Joydeep, are you ready?
Yeah, I am.
Okay.
Thank you, Yulia.
So we'll do this in a more informal fashion just to wrap up the speakers portion of this morning session. So Joydeep, maybe you can elaborate or give us some insight about, in your experience, particularly as coordinator for EGN India, what have been the most urgent or prominent climate change or environmental issues that you've covered or that you've seen in your experience?
Right. Thanks for the question. Yeah, very important question, and I can take it from there. And in fact, my life has been made much simpler by the previous panelists. And now I'm quite glad that I didn't actually make a formal presentation, because we can now drill down to actual story ideas. We can now drill down to actual stories to be done, and hopefully we can have a conversation with everybody in this room and all the entire audience, so that we can come up with specific story ideas, including collaborative story ideas. That, I hope, is what this will lead to, some really concrete things. So in answer to your question, Yulia, let me start by trying to sort of categorize the climate crisis stories into ways that will make it easier for us to look at the story ideas. Okay, so when you're looking at climate crisis stories, and of course it goes without saying that all these are human rights stories. I'm not even going into that, because to me that's so obvious that I don't need to go into that. I'm sure all my colleagues are perfectly aware of this. So let's take that as a given. We all know that's a fact. Looking at that, what are the most prominent climate crises that we are facing right now? I'm not talking about crises that will hit us later, hit our children or our grandchildren. I'm not talking about safeguarding a house so that it doesn't catch fire. I'm talking about a house that's already on fire. I'm talking about climate crises now, climate impacts now, today on us. What are those? You can essentially think of them as falling into two categories. One are the sudden impacts, the storms, the floods, the flash floods, the landslides. And the second lot are the chronic impacts, the drought, the salinity, ocean acidity, springs in the hills drying out. These are not immediate sudden impacts, but they're so severe chronic impacts that they really hit human rights of communities, including ourselves. And it's very important that we do stories on them. If we can get very good stories on them. See, looking at sudden impacts, I don't have to tell any of you to cover that. When there is a storm, when there is a flash flood, when there is a landslide, all of you, I'm absolutely sure, will rush and do that story. Nobody has to tell you to do that story. We are all reporters, and we cover that automatically. What I am requesting my colleagues to look at is, when you are doing those stories, even in the immediate, and I understand that we are often then working on 1 hour, 2 hour deadlines. Even there, do try your best to explore the climate connect. Check if there is a climate connect to that particular disaster. So if an earthquake has happened, if a tsunami has happened, there is no climate connect. If a storm has happened, if a typhoon has hit the Philippines, check. Is there a climate connect? What does the IPCC say about frequency of storms, about intensity of storms changing with climate change? And it's actually quite important, because I understand very well, I've worked in a news agency, that if I have to start, then a storm has hit a city in Indonesia, and I have to report from there. I have to put out the immediate story within the next 15 minutes. So I really don't have time at that stage to figure out the climate connect. So keep that backgrounder ready. This is where organizations like RWI can come in very, very handy. This is the kind of work that good think tanks are doing now. I'm sure RWI is doing. I'm sure we do it at the EJN through our reporter resources. So keep that handy. so that you can immediately plug in at Climate Connect. You can immediately know that if a storm has come and hit the Vietnam coast, who do I call to check if there is a Climate Connect? So that's now available. Please use that. And there is a new science, there is a new academic discipline that is developing over the last few years. These are called Attribution Studies. The group of researchers, and an increasingly larger group of researchers, are studying events like storms, heat waves, floods, to see if this particular event is connected to climate change, and if so, to what extent. Look for those attribution studies. Again, somewhere, an area where I think RWI can surely help. Look elsewhere if you don't find it in the country. And then, as Amy pointed out, it's very important to look for positive stories, because there is definitely an audience fatigue when you're talking of doing more and more doom and gloom stories. I'm not against doom and gloom stories. It's important to show exactly how bad this impact is right now. But with that, if we can do positive stories, if we find good positive stories, I think we should be doing them. So here's my suggestion. When we talk about sudden climate impacts, like say storms, look for stories on developments in early warning systems. Meteorologists in Asia, and especially Southeast Asia, have tremendously improved their ability to track the paths of storms from the time those storms form in the sea. I think these are good stories to do. And it is a result of this improvement in meteorology that today, if a typhoon hits the Philippines, the number of deaths is far less than if an equally strong typhoon had hit 20 or 30 years ago, because of the early warning systems that the meteorologists have given us. It's a good story to do. Good stories to do on disaster management. To what extent are governments in Southeast Asia prepared? Do we have storm shelters? Do we have storm shelters along the coasts? In Bali, in Yogyakarta, in any of the coastal areas of Malaysia? So if we don't have storm shelters, where will people go? Especially the poor people who don't always live in brick and mortar houses with concrete roofs. Those are the houses that get hit first. Many of our fishing communities do not have roofs with concrete structures. Those are the roofs that blow away in a storm. Where will they go? Have the governments planned for it? These are stories or story ideas that I think will work. I would very much like you to tell me if you have if you have tried to do these stories and have faced problems, or whether you would like to do these stories so that we can discuss them. The other set of stories are about the chronic impacts. And let me tell you quite frankly, we are journalists, we are journalists, not activists. We do our stories. And one of the incentives we definitely have while doing our stories is that when we do a good story, we want recognition for that. We want, hopefully, we apply for awards, we apply for competitions. And we are happy, and we should be happy if we win an award. So how do you win an award? Through exclusive stories? Where do you get an exclusive story? And when you come to chronic climate impacts, that's the area to look at, because that's not being covered adequately. Salinity is a story that is hitting all our countries very, very badly along the coast. And it is not being covered adequately. And it is actually not a difficult story to do. I will show you an example of a salinity story that is relatively easy to do and definitely qualifies as an investigative story, which I think you could easily enter into journalism competitions. Then there are stories on ocean acidity. All our countries have large fishing communities. We have large populations, very dependent on fishing. They're all being hit very badly, and we know this. I know that many of you have done stories on effects of ocean acidity on fishing communities. But I have a feeling that we have done a lot, but not enough. That is something I'm looking at. Another thing, a set of story ideas. Do look in the hill communities. Do ask them, what is their source of water? What is their daily source of water? And you will find in Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, in so many countries, northern Thailand, the main source of water for daily domestic use is the local spring, which comes down from the hillside. And one of the impacts of climate change is that the springs are drying out. This is a very important story from human rights point of view, from the women's rights point of view, because women now have to go much further every day to fetch the water if they are not getting water close by. I know communities in northern Thailand who now have to spend 2 hours getting water for their daily needs at home. I do not have confirmation, but I've heard that there are places in Indonesia with the similar situation. So these are stories which A, are important stories to do, B, are exclusive stories, and C, are stories that are likely to have maximum policy impact. There are examples. Amy showed a couple of examples. There are other examples that if you do these stories before they become full-blown crises, then policymakers also become aware and take steps. I know of a story in India where the issue was that the government had relocated an entire village from the coast because of salinity. But in the relocated spot, they were facing serious drinking water shortage because it had all been done in such a hurry. And the story that was done led to the government taking corrective measures and putting in more drinking water facilities. So your stories can have impacts. And these are all human rights stories. And to do them, you know very well, I don't know to tell you, you have to go and talk to the affected people. The only tip is talk to the elderly people more than many of us do. Because if you ask them to recount how things have changed, you're likely to get a better story. But of course, you'll have to get corroboration from scientists. There is another angle of stories that I do want to bring to your attention, because I find that these are stories that need to be done and should be done and not being done enough. Now, many of us in the world are talking about mitigation projects, specifically renewable energy projects, solar, wind. And I'm a big enthusiast of renewable energy. And I'm very glad that the energy systems are moving to renewable energy. But nothing is without a cost. To make a large solar farm, especially in crowded countries, like in our countries in Southeast Asia or in South Asia, you have to find land. Where will you find that land? Will it be somebody's farm what happens to that farmer? It's important to do these stories. Why? Because if you do these stories now, early, and strongly enough, governments may actually avoid the kind of mistakes they made, or the previous governments made over the last 100 and odd years, while they put in the infrastructure for coal plants, oil wells, etc. So it's important to do those stories. It's important to point out stories on maladaptation, wrong adaptation. In many countries, when the sea level is rising, the first reaction of governments is to build a wall, a sea wall. This is a reaction that spreads from New York to Japan. And our countries are not immune from this. But what happens when you build a seawall? A stronger current then moves and is deflected and hits adjacent coastlines harder. And it's in the adjacent coastlines, because the government has prioritized the safety of expensive infrastructure, a port or a factory. So they have built a seawall in front. And now the current is moving in both directions as a result, and going and hitting the fishing communities on both sides. There are examples after examples after examples of this. It's important to do these stories. It's important to do these stories so that these maladaptation does not become even more widespread than it's doing now. I am going to see if I can just share a few stories just to tell you what I was talking about. Hopefully I can share the screen. Let me see. I'll try. Okay. Yeah. Is it coming on? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So I just wanted to. Can you see my screen now? The photo story on the screen?
Yes, can.
Okay, thanks. So these photo stories work very well actually. Life in Bangladesh after the last cyclone, and you get a good photo and a strong photo like this. That works. As I said, I'm not going to show everything, but when you get a photo like this, you are going to get impact. And it's not that unusual to have a photo like this. When you have a photo like this, that a resident is having to get the daily domestic needs of water filled in this sort of a situation where the flood water has inundated the well on which she depends. So she's essentially getting very, very toxic water, but she has no choice. Look at the queue of women waiting for a water truck. They're waiting for a drinking water truck. All I'm saying is that these stories are there to be done, and these can be powerful stories. This, of course, wouldn't make sense without the caption, so I'm not going into it. But this shows after a flood or a storm, when people lose their homes, one of the impacts is pollution, because now they have to use old-fashioned stoves like this to do their cooking. This is how people are forced to move after a flood. This is how people try their best to keep the flood waters away. And remember, this is all saline water that's coming and completely destroying their farms and fields. efforts to rebuild their homes. There are climate refugees moving from the village. Okay, let me see if I can share one or two more stories. Yeah, okay. I'll share just one more. I can see we don't have much time, so I'll just share one more. This is a story that I was talking about salinity. Now, what did we do for this story? Our reporter, our colleague, went to these villages, spoke to people, the residents, about where they get their water from, went to those sources, picked up the water samples in sterilized jars, and having done that, brought it back to a laboratory in Karachi and asked the laboratory to analyze that water. And the laboratory analysis results we printed, we published. And there was really nothing more that needed to be done. It showed very clearly that the extent to which this water is not fit for human use. And let me tell you that these laboratory tests are not expensive. They're not. This entire set of laboratory tests here cost a little over, not even $1,500 US, somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 US dollars. And I'm sure that if your media outlet is unable to give you that 1,000 or 1,500, you can seek fellowships, you can seek help to do these stories, and that will immensely strengthen your story, because then nobody can say that, oh, this reporter is exaggerating the impact. You are doing it the hard way, the scientific way, showing the impact of chloride in the water, how hard the water is, what are the total dissolved solids in the water. And from an accredited laboratory, you are showing the acidity level, the turbidity level. And that is what I'm inviting all of you to do. I am going to stop here because I can see that we don't have too much time, and I would really love to have a discussion on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Joydeep. Great tips, great practical insight for journalists covering these issues. Now, I would like to move into the Q&A portion of our program. I see one person, is it Mukesh Pokhrel, that's posted something in the Q&A chat, but I'm not quite sure if this was a comment or a question. Mr. Mukesh Pokhrel, would you like to speak and raise a question that you might have? You can unmute your Zoom. Otherwise, we will take this as a comment. Is Mukesh Pokhrel available to speak? So it says, in the name of climate change, money has been invested, but the people have not gotten the money or have had access to it. I'm trying to interpret this question as to it's relating to climate financing, I suppose, a big topic during COP26. However, for people on the ground, those that are actually impacted by climate change, the question of funds or money to mitigate or adapt to climate change is not channeled to them. Can one of the speakers maybe address this? Joydeep, would you like to tackle this one?
Yes, please. Yes, if I understand Mukesh's question correctly, it is he raises the issue that even if the governments in developing countries get some climate finance from industrialized countries, that money is not necessarily going to the affected communities. I agree. This has been happening. And yes, this is another story idea to pursue quite aggressively. Yes, absolutely.
Claudia, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. It's one of the issues that, for instance, is mentioned as the last principle of the framework principles on human rights and environment that I mentioned by the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Environment, previous one, John Knox. And I think here the issue is that any action that we do to address the climate crisis or address biodiversity loss, so on, needs to have a human rights-based approach. And this has been highlighted in the Human Rights Council and in various interpretations of treaty bodies. So I think in terms of journalism, I think if you have your story and then link it up with what has been said at these Human Rights Council, for instance, that it's a high level council in terms of UN, that can be a good strategy. And there also, I mean, I think the issue is, of course, that the money is not flowing in the right direction many times. And there, what sometimes can be used is the idea of human rights safeguards. For instance, many banks, such as the World Bank, has its own safeguards and really look at those safeguards. And then some of them have, some banks also have these specific places where they can raise those concerns. And just to give you an example of these kind of issues as well, not only on the climate side, but also how they are connected to biodiversity. In Kenya, there was a project called the Water Towers that has been having many problems along the way because the community wasn't consulted. It was a community that had been there ancestrally, this connection with the land that we have been talking about, that they were doing a sustainable use of the environment, and even though they were going to be displaced in the name of climate change. So what they did was, I mean, we had a dialogue there with various organizations that were in addressing this conservation and human rights connection. But this project was specifically framed as a climate adaptation project. And what happened is that it had to get some people killed for really having this global attention into the project, which is really sad. I think the idea of preventing these issues by highlighting them, it's really important. But what happened afterwards, and after the a special rapporteur, UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Environment, put the finger on that, was that the funding that was coming from China, that was coming from the European Union, stopped flowing. So I think when you address these issues, just there, as it was said before, maladaptation, wrong adaptation, but also try to look, where's the funding coming from? Because those kind of stories are also powerful. And if you can get them into Europe, into the countries that are actually funding those projects, or into the hands of those banks, that they may even not know the unintended effects that their projects are having.
Thank you, Claudia. May I go to Amy? So just picking up on this point about climate financing and how important it is to cover these stories. Have there been examples of stories that ENG have covered or maybe supported where the issue of climate financing is addressed? Now, in my experience observing journalists, at least in Indonesia, covering these issues, it's a bit more challenging, first of all, to find the data. Picking up on Claudia's point about where the funding is coming from. And then the second point about climate financing is how to get readers and audiences actually interested in these stories. Maybe you can share some insight on this.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think, you know, with all themes and issues, money is always you know, really important, you know, angle to look at. And climate financing can be a pretty complex, you know, issue to look into. And you know, at the recent COP26, there's some decisions on carbon trade and financing. So I really encourage journalists to make sure they are up to date with all these latest decisions and mechanism. And of course, the issue of just transition, and just for who, right? As developing countries demanding developed countries to do more, to put in more money to help developing countries, lower income countries, to make the shift from coal to renewable energy. That is another big story there for journalists to track and to follow. And of course, at the COP, we have a lot of commitments. Whether or not governments follow up on those commitments and put in real money in there, is something really, really important for journalists to track, and to constantly, raise this and put pressure on those countries who have made the commitments to realize, to fulfill their commitments. I think these are all stories that we've been supporting. And recently, EJN has worked with several partners, including in Indonesia. Project Multilateral is our partner. Also in Hong Kong, we are working with Initium. In the Philippines, Daily Inquirer. We have put out a special project. In fact, I think one of the session in this conference, our team will be sharing more about how they've been working together on a special project on looking at the investment in coal-fired plants. Who are the investors? Who are people putting money in new and in existing and new coal-fired plants? What are happening to these investments? Following some announcement like in China to stop new. Financing new coal-fired plants in other countries. Does that mean, what about those commitments they made, for example, in Indonesia through the Belt and Road Project? Are these, are they talking about those that are not yet committed? What about those that are committed? Are they going to still be built? Who are benefiting from these investments? What are the roles of local authorities, local politicians? What kind of a role they're playing in facilitating these investments? And of course, there's a lot of stories we can do around subsidies as well. There are countries providing subsidies to cars, to coal-fired plants, and to other industries and sectors that are contributing to greenhouse gas emission. These are really, really useful money stories that we can do.
Thank you, Amy. Joydeep, want to jump in?
Yeah, thanks, Yulia. I just want to supplement what Amy said with one or 2 points. One is that if we look at the climate pledges, or the technically called nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, of all the governments, and especially the updated NDCs, updated just a few months ago or a few weeks ago, you will find that almost all of them are completely dependent on financing from industrialized countries. If this finance stream does not work far, far better than it's working now, then there is no way really to combat the climate crisis. And there are important stories to be done here. One is that to look at what the climate finance streams are right now, and that, by the way, is available online. The Green Climate Fund, the World Bank are the two main sources, and both their climate finance is how much they're spending on which project specifically. All that is available online on their websites. So those stories are easy to do. There are stories about climate finance and climate justice, which are strong stories, which I'm sure you'll get you a lot of audience. There are stories about OECD saying that right now the figure from industrialized countries is over $80 billion a year, and just about no government in the developing world believes that OECD figure. Ask your government. Do they believe that OECD figure? You'll find that they don't. Some governments will say so publicly, some will not say so publicly, but not a single developing country believes that figure. So there are stories to be done here. And this is something that, forget about governments in industrialized countries, even green NGOs in industrialized countries are completely unaware of. So there are strong finance stories to be done, and there are sources available. Thanks.
Before I get to Nadia, Rosli, and Erti Putri, 2 questions in the chat box. May I invite Claudia to add something to this line of questioning?
Yeah. So my point here would be that environmental law, specifically multilateral environmental agreements such as the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, of the Convention of Biological Diversity, don't have any accountability mechanisms. And that's why also, again, weaving into human rights law becomes powerful, because human rights law, constitutional law, does have accountability spaces. And I put in the chat an RWI report that we conducted together with the Southeast Asian academics and practitioners, where we dwell more into specific cases of how constitutional law, for example, was used in order to achieve positive socio-ecological outcomes. So I think the idea of accountability becomes a very good rationale and good argument to link environment and human rights.
Okay, thank you, Claudia. I will now invite Nadia Rosli to ask her question. I don't know if you have been unmuted.
Hi everyone, Nadia here. I'm a journalist from Malaysia. I just have a question regarding a very sensitive topic in Malaysia, which is covered under our Sedition Act. So it's race, religion, and royalty. Those are the 3 things that are very dangerous for journalists to touch on in this country. But having said that, there have been a lot more stories about the environment where there have been linkages of royalty-linked projects, whether it's affecting the environment or biodiversity in various places. But it is still a challenge for journalists to cover this kind of linkages. And then also we know that even publishing these stories, we don't expect any action to be taken up by the authorities because the royalty is protected under the Constitution. So I'm just wondering, are there any creative angles to write the stories to make it more impactful, whether from a human rights perspective or any other case studies that you have where there have been action, even if it involves very higher up people or higher level people involved in these projects?
Thank you, Nadia. I'm assuming this is for Amy or Joydeep. Which one of you wants to tackle this?
Sure, I can have a quick go first. Thanks, Nadia. Yeah, I think this is definitely a very sensitive topic, and I think in Thailand you have the same problem as well, and even more so, I think. I think, first of all, I think journalists should be discussing with their editors about potential legal consequences and to understand very well where the boundaries are and having legal supports to make sure that they don't run into legal issues or threats. And then at the same time, if the assessment is the story would put you at risk, I think we should start looking at working with journalists outside of the countries to report on such stories. Of course, you could contribute stories, anonymously to media outside of your country. We also support at EJN. We also have websites where we publish stories outside of countries or, at more the sort of regional global level that helps to bring the issue out. So working, with journalists outside the countries, that would be my suggestion. For instance, we can also look at some strategies like at EJN, we have supported journalists in Thailand to report on issues in Cambodia and Myanmar where local journalists won't be able to cover those stories in their own countries, but the Thai journalists managed to go go there, take the, do the stories and publish in media outside of those countries. Yeah.
Okay, I suppose I'm gonna go next to Erti. Let me find you. Where are you? So Erti has a question. Would you like to ask it yourself, Erti? And you can unmute yourself. Erti, would you like to ask your question to the panelists? If not, I will read it for you. You can unmute. Okay, to save time, maybe I will ask for Erti. So the question is, how do we make the governments, especially in Asia, be more concerned to reduce global climate crisis? As we know that China is still using more coal, making more pollutions, and in ASEAN, we're not concerned about climate finance and still running to make better sustainable life. The second question is about how to educate civil society or society in general about taking more action as well. Anyone want to tackle this? Claudia, Amy, Joydeep, maybe Claudia first.
Yeah, I think there are many strategies to actually try to get, countries to act. And I think, there are many strategies, but I think using the law strategically, I think it's a critical one. And while manifestations and so on that are peaceful are part of enjoying one's own human rights of freedom of opinion and expression and freedom of peaceful association, and I think they are extremely important. I think that in combination with using the law, and I don't necessarily mean only going to court, I'm saying using the law, for instance, to get information. Many countries, including those in Southeast Asia, have provisions either in the constitution or in secondary legal instruments that provide that authorities need to provide that information within a certain number of days and with certain quality. So if you, when doing your request as a journalist, quote that specific article in that specific law, then the authority, it's more likely probably to give that information. And then I think also in terms of education, that was the question. I could invite you also to look at the Children Environmental Rights Initiative that is under the auspices of the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Environment. And they have a really nice initiative together with various UN agencies and others, which are trying to really bring this information and education to children, not only seeing them as recipients of information, recipients of education, but also recognizing their agency and power. And they are speaking at the UN Human Rights Council, including there has been some of these issues in Southeast Asia.
Okay, thank you, Claudia. We actually have time for only one question, and I will like to invite Tonggo Simangunsong. Would you like to ask the question yourself? You can unmute.
Yeah, thank you very much. I want to ask a simple question. Like Sumatera, we had important issues like deforestation. I want to ask.
Oh, you are breaking up your audio.
I want to ask your suggestion. When we are covering deforestation issue, what are the interesting angles to get attention from international audience? Can you give me tips so that story will have impact?
Okay, thank you, Tonggo. Maybe I will repeat. I will aim this towards Joydeep maybe. So in covering deforestation issues like in Sumatra, Tonggo's question is, how do we get interesting angles to obtain attention from international audiences? Any tips that you can give?
Yeah, okay. I'll directly address Tonggo because he did this story for us for the third poll. And he has got, that story has actually got a lot of hits. It has
Tongo
got
actually already knows what he's doing.
yeah. So he has done this story for the third poll. And I'm very glad he has done this story. The reason why I raised my hand is that I think stories on hydropower in Southeast Asia are going to become crucially important, because after China's declaration that it will no longer finance coal power plants in Southeast Asia, we can expect a big increase in dam building in Southeast Asia. And we are already facing very huge problems due to dam building in Southeast Asia, especially all along the Mekong Basin. All of you know this. All of you have been reporting on this. So the solution to the climate crisis shouldn't become a bigger crisis. I just want to point that out. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Joydeep. Oh my God, I'm getting tongue-tied. Thank you, Joydeep. We have time for absolutely one last question. Apologies to all the participants. So I'm now going to invite Alex. If you'd like to ask the question yourself, please unmute.
Yeah, thank you. In Indonesia ya. Yep. Saya Alex, jurnalis di Papua. Mungkin pemateri semua sudah cukup mendengar tentang Papua di Indonesia, di wilayah timur Indonesia, dengan aneka persoalan, problem yang juga paling menguat bukan hanya soal politik ya, itu kita mungkin bisa dipinggirkan dulu, tapi persoalan lingkungan hidup, kehutanan, perkebunan yang begitu complicated, begitu kompleks di sini. Apakah dari jaringan ini, dari jejaring ini mau membantu kami untuk melakukan peliputan-peliputan yang lebih kuat ya di wilayah kami ini. Sementara waktu memang tidak banyak jurnalis yang mau serius mengusut soal-soal lingkungan hidup, kehutanan, juga perkebunan di daerah kami. Banyak yang hanya meliput di kota-kota. Sedangkan persoalan isu-isu lingkungan hidup, kehutanan, perkebunan itu justru jauh di pelosok-pelosok yang susah bagi kami untuk jangkau juga. Persoalan geografis, tapi juga soal-soal keamanan. Apalagi kami jika melakukan investigasi pasti akan menemui banyak kesulitan. Penting bagi kami juga belajar lebih banyak lagi dari pengalaman jurnalis di daerah-daerah lain, terutama di daerah-daerah konflik yang meliput isu-isu sosial, ya, isu-isu politik, isu-isu ekonomi, budaya setempat dalam situasi konflik sampai misalnya perang, tapi juga konflik investasi yang berkaitan. Bukan hanya wilayah konflik yang perang misalnya. Isu kami persisnya di sini adalah memang awal mulanya konflik kehutanan, perkebunan begitu, isu-isu lingkungan, tapi sekarang semakin menguat pada konflik bersenjata di Papua. Sehingga kami memang perlu banyak belajar dan dukungan dari jejaring ini untuk kami bisa mengekspos lebih banyak, menginvestigasi berbagai isu. Pada prinsipnya ini bermula dari konflik lahan, konflik tanah, konflik investasi sebenarnya. Yang kemudian,
sorry Alex, can you make this more concise?
Yeah.
I think we understand your question already. May I?
Okay, so
invite the panelists to answer?
Ingin jejaring ini kemudian memberi semacam support, dukungan kepada kami. Tidak banyak, beberapa jurnalis dalam saya mengorganisirnya. Apakah bisa kemudian dalam jejaring ini mendukung kami?
Alex,
terima kasih. Thank you.
Let's invite the panelists to answer. Terima kasih, Alex. Okay, I'm going to address this to Amy. To Amy, perhaps can start off the issue of collaboration, maybe joint investigations for very complicated issues like this.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. This is a very, very important issue that he has brought up. And of course, Alex is working in a much more challenging environment that we all know. And I think there are lots of resources there, Alex, that you can look into and networks. I think within Indonesia, of course, you have PPMN. We also have the Society of the Indonesian Environmental Journalists, SIEJ. Joining these networks will help you, build your connection with peers in Indonesia. And there are also networks outside of Indonesia, like EJN of Journalism Network. It's a global network. And I would very much encourage you to join these networks so that you have more knowledge of and access to the various resources and opportunities out there. There are lots of resources available for journalists covering deforestation, covering land conflicts. All the issues you're raising are really important issues, and you are right there. You have the ability to cover and to report on these really important issues, and these stories need to go out. So there are lots of funding going on. The Pulitzer Center, for example, now has a fellowship program, very good, rainforest fellowship program, supporting journalists to cover forest stories. So there are lots and lots of resources for journalists to cover these stories. And if language or is a challenge, please feel free to connect. With these various networks, including EJN, with Florence is here on this call. She is our Indonesia coordinator. I'm sure Florence can continue this discussion with you and point you to some of the support that are out there.
Thank you, Amy. I apologize. We have to end our session today. Thank you so much to our distinguished speakers, Claudia Ituarte-Lima, Amy Sim, Joydeep Gupta, for such an enlightening session. I will now hand over the session back to Nana. Thank you.
Thank you, Yulia.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much to Yulia Supadmo, Claudia Ituarte-Lima, Amy Sim, and Joydeep Gupta for the session today. To the participants, please find the feedback form in the chat box. We highly appreciate it if you can fill it and confirm in the form if you need to get an e-certificate for the session. We are now entering the break session for like 7 minutes because we still have another session after the break. So yeah, don't forget to join in the next session as well via the link in the chat box. So see you.
For human rights